Hey everybody, great Monday to you. Welcome to Zinni 62 Live, and it's my pleasure to introduce once again Alex Epstein. Alex, how you doing?
Hey, good to be back. Good to see you.
Nice to have you here. Alex is the author of this fantastic book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and he is the Center for Industrial Progress. Uh, Alex, where are we? First of all, how are you doing through all this mess? And then, in the context of the great book that you wrote, in the context that we had, where are we from your perspective?
Oh man, that's the second question is a particularly big question. I mean, I personally I don't think that should be of too much interest to people, but I mean, I definitely I've had the experience of being affected professionally and personally. A lot of my work involves delivering my ideas, my message to live audiences, and that's something that's not happening right now. So that definitely affects my business and requires adaptation and that kind of thing. But certainly, what I'm really concerned about with this is that you're seeing the livelihoods of tens of millions, I think ultimately hundreds of millions of Americans negatively affected. I mean, 30 million or so unemployed, and that doesn't even begin to tell the story of what people are going through. And from the beginning, something that really bothered me, even though I was very concerned about the severity and contagiousness of this virus, was that there didn't seem to be much regard at all for what locking people down, which means, in a sense, imprisoning them in their homes, what that would do to their livelihoods. There was just this fear that, oh my gosh, this is going to overtake everything. And kind of the most knee jerk and least thought through response possible, I think, is just to tell everyone, hey, stay inside and stop doing what you're doing, except if it's a grocery store or a bank or sometimes a liquor store. I just didn't think that was at all thought through. And I didn't consider it an American response. And in America, you can't just say, oh, we think there's a threat, you might be a threat, therefore we get to lock you up. I mean, we would never do this with something like murder or driving. You could say, well, certain number of people are murderers and certain number of people are going to murder today, but you don't get to hold everyone in their homes and say, well, somebody's going to murder, so we get to lock you in your homes. You don't get to say somebody's going to be in a car crash, so you don't get to drive. You have to have specific evidence. And so my view of an American policy would be more like what South Korea did, which is actually test and isolate the individuals who are demonstrably dangerous, who actually have it. Focus your resources on that. And then the rest of us, leave us free to live our lives and make the best judgments we can. And we could talk about what that would have looked like, but I think that would have been a much better policy, a much more American policy. And I think we could have avoided much of the damage that we're experiencing today, particularly in California, where I think Governor Newsom has been particularly a villain in this saga.
Oh, he's my buddy, but that's okay.
Okay, well, pass on my non-compliments.
Okay. Where are we with respect to this idea that, first of all, around what really got me originally about this, and still gets me, are publication after publication after publication that says, hey, the air is cleaner, and I saw, and it is cleaner, but
Mm-hmm.
but there was a particular quote from a representative of one of the World Economic Associations, this one located in the UK, who basically said it's not good enough because the population hasn't shrank enough. In other words, the sentence that I read was chilling. This person actually wrote about her, Claire, I forgot Claire's last name, but she seemed to be gleeful over the development, but sad that more people were not sick and passing away. That's what she wrote. I don't know her in person, and I would hope that she would be of the mind to say that's not what I meant, but it's what she wrote. And I've seen that idea repeated again and again and again. Then I happened to run across a document that was written in 2008 that discussed what the pandemic and its impact on coal, among other things. And it talked about the fact that a number of our energy sources are still based on the use of coal in the production of energy. There are 18 states that are in that position right now, and those supply lines could be impacted without a plan for the pandemic. And then on top of that, the more current information that is that says, well, renewable energy sources are suffering economically for many of the reasons you stated as a as a result during the pandemic. What should be our policy now with respect to traditional energy and also with respect to coal?
And you raised a lot of different issues there. And I think maybe the first one is the right one to start with, because you've heard this general idea that the environment is now much better because of, because of the pandemic slash the lockdown.
Mhm.
And one thing to notice there is that there's obviously just a massive increase in human suffering that's going on around the world, really, that's affecting billions of people at this point. I think a combination of the disease and ill-advised policies to address it. But nevertheless, I think everyone can agree there's just been a massive increase in human suffering, and then to a lesser extent death. But certainly we're dealing with a lot of death from the virus, and I think we'll deal with a lot of death from the attempts to fight the virus as well, in terms of locking people down and suicides and people not getting other medical procedures. So I think it should make us suspicious when people are being celebratory about this and saying, oh, this is a good thing. And when they talk about the environment, to me, that means that they have an idea of the environment that's really divorced from human well-being. Now, you can say, of course, yeah, if we stop driving cars and running factories, then there will be somewhat less emissions in the air. But then we're also being deprived of the benefits of those cars and factories. And there are reasons, as I talk about in my book, why we're using fossil fuels. Namely, that's the lowest cost, most reliable solution for most of billions of people in the world. We don't use fossil fuels because it's a conspiracy. We use it because it's the lowest cost way for billions of people to get the reliable energy that they need. So I would just say that I think the world has become a worse place to live overall. I mean, much worse with this pandemic and the response to it. And so when I think of environment, I think of the human environment. So I think, yeah, even if certain portions of the air are cleaner, the overall human environment is much worse. And I think with industry generally makes the human environment a much better place to live. In terms of what's happening to the different kinds of sources, the issue with what are called renewables, which that's sort of a package of what I would call the reliable renewables and the unreliable renewables, like something like hydropower, that's a very cost effective form of electricity that can more than compete with fossil fuels and nuclear if you have the right location. A place like Washington State doesn't work, in most places in the middle of the country because you don't have the right kind of topography. But that's a competitive thing. It's limited. It can't exist everywhere, and it's primarily for electricity, not for transportation. Say it doesn't fly a plane, but it's useful. But if you take the unreliable renewables like solar and wind, those are not self-sufficient energy sources. Those sources are always dependent on some reliable source to prop them up, because you have sunlight and you have wind. Those aren't reliable, controllable sources. They need basically 100% backup. And that means it has to come from coal, gas, oil, theoretically, that we mostly use that for transportation, and then nuclear. And so what's happening is when there's just a general decline in the use of energy because everybody is being stopped and they're poorer, yeah, it's going to hurt everyone. But I think a huge mistake in response to this is try to mandate even more of the unreliable renewables, because then that's just going to raise the cost of energy for everybody. And if you try to do it enough, and if you don't have enough backup, then it's going to lead to things like blackouts. And as bad as a pandemic is, you do not want a country that that is an almost unlivable human environment, particularly if you think of like these major cities. What happens if you lose power for a long time? So I think that, yeah, we should, if anything, be focused on how can we become even more efficient and productive with energy and everything else, because we've had such a huge blow to our standard of living. Whereas it would be terrible to say, well, we've become poor with the lockdown and we're going to make ourselves even poorer by making energy expensive, which then makes everything else more expensive.
What should Oakland do with respect to the Vulcan oversized terminal? Because they've been fighting in court. Meanwhile, you have Utah, Wyoming, other states. The people there are working in traditional industry. They need the employment. There have been efforts to make sure that those production facilities have been made cleaner, if you will. But now the need really is to get them to their supply, to their demand areas overseas. Should Oakland continue to stand in the way?
No, I mean, we had an extensive discussion about this last time. Hopefully you can link to it because I think we got into a lot of good details,
Absolutely.
but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's certainly, I mean, this thing should have been approved a long time ago. It's a valuable project. They've gone to crazy lengths to make sure that almost no particles of anything can get in the air. I mean, they're using covered cars for coal, which you don't even need to do. There's not remotely a pollution issue for Oakland in terms of having trains come in that carry coal in them. And even if you think about the states that are using the coal, they're burning the coal very cleanly and they generally have good air quality and they have high standards of living. I just want to keep impressing upon people when we think about policies, we really need to think about, does this make a place a better place to live overall? We can't just look at the negative side effect of it. We have to look at the benefit along with the side effect. And with modern coal burning, you can get quite low emissions and then a huge benefit in terms of reliable, low cost electricity. And there are reasons why other states are doing that. And there are reasons why California is importing a lot of fossil fuel based electricity from other places. Like we're cooking our books to act like we consume less of it than we do, but we import it from other states.
You know, in the between the time that we talked, as a gigantic Star Trek fan, it occurred to me, and also someone who's turning 58 this year, it occurred to me that when I was coming up, many of the devices that are now common, like for example, this iPhone,
Mm-hmm.
Steve Jobs said he got basically as an idea from the Star Trek communicator. And there are
Mm-hmm.
other examples in our society of consumer electronics that were spurred by that were spurred by um, companies like or productions like Star Trek. But now today we're in more of, and I say this on May 4th, May the 4th be with you, but we're in a Star Wars society where Star Wars borrowed from Star Trek and was less interested by its impact on society and how that technology, however you describe it, was applied in real life. Point that I'm making is that it seems to me, and I like your comment on this, that as we have moved forward in our lives, I don't know if it's evolving, we become less interested as a society in applying technology to solve problems. And now we have unfortunately a gigantic section of society that seems to just want to say no to things they don't understand. Is that a proper way of looking at what's happening?
Yeah, I think in general, it tells a lot about a society to see how it reacts to the new. Because whenever you have something new, there are going to be negatives and there are going to be positives. But in general, if it's a free society with proper laws that protect our rights against people actively harming us, in general, the new things are going to be better. But you can see with a lot of new things, the focus is on the negative of it.
Yes.
And to say, not just focusing on the negative, but to say it has a negative, so we just need to not do anything. So an example for this of this would be fracking, which is a technology that's involved in the production of oil and gas. And fracking is responsible for something like half of the United States' oil production. And it's a really ingenious process that allows us to extract oil and gas that we were never able to before. And in terms of the side effects of it, there's nothing really distinctive about it compared to other forms of mining and drilling, which we do for everything in life. You know, we're always mining. Everything we get is ultimately coming from mining. Certainly your iPhone and your Tesla, and these are all mining type based processes, and you can think of drilling as a form of mining. And yet when something is new, it's viewed as, oh, it's fracking, that sounds new, it's underground, what if this happens, what if this happens? And the response is not, hey, let's pass good laws to limit the risk. It's let's stop everything. And you can even see this interestingly with
Yeah,
this
it's funny you
new.
said that
Oh yeah, go
because
ahead.
someone said about me, so he spoke me in favor of fracking, and I had never mentioned fracking one way or the other, just to show you how crazy this whole thing is. I mean,
Mm,
and so but it's wild, and the reason I think this person did so is because I've long been a proponent of making sure that the truth was told with respect to Chevron and Ecuador, which I want to spend any time talking about here because it's not appropriate. But I think that person used that as some sort of jumping off point for some sort of um, um, uncoordinated, uninformed, and ill-placed point. This is like 6 or 7 years ago. But my
mhm.
point is that it shows you the links that people will go to just to say that they're on a political side, as opposed to understanding what it is they're talking about. You know, uh, I wasn't even aware what fracking was, so I thinking I thought, what's fracking, right? And so talk to my viewers about what fracking is, just for the record, so we can get that out of the way.
Sure, I already said a little bit about
Yeah.
it, but I mean, if you think about, so oil and gas. So I mean, these are two of the most valuable things in our lives. So oil we use for most of our mobility is based on oil, because oil, is this liquid and it's this super concentrated source of energy, and so it allows us to do things like take a cargo ship across the ocean or fly a plane. And there's nothing really that's comparable to that. And then gas is gas that warms our home. Gas is the most flexible way of generating electricity, so it can, like, when electricity demand goes up quickly, it can cycle up. When it goes down, it can cycle down. So I mean, there's all, and these are both used in all the kinds of plastics and synthetics. So if you think about even many of the life-saving materials in with COVID-19, a lot of these come from oil and gas. So oil and gas are just these incredible values, and they come from the ground. And most people think, oh, well, you just stick a drill in and then it easily comes out. But most oil and gas are trapped in rocks in ways that you would have no idea how to get them out. They're in these rock formations. And so what fracking does is, like, if you I don't have it with me, but you could just imagine I would be holding a rock and it would just look like a rock. And you would never think this rock had oil in it or gas in it. It just looked like a normal rock you'd pick up on the ground. But what fracking does is it's short for hydraulic fracturing. So it takes a high pressure jet of water and it creates fractures in the rock to then release the oil and gas from the rock that exists there, but that doesn't seem like it could possibly exist. And as I said, half of the oil and gas that we're producing in this country involves this amazing procedure. And there's a lot of different kinds of concerns about it. But as I said, these are not really based on studying how it works and what the actual dangers are. It's really focused on, well, this is a new thing. And so it's a new thing that's underground. And so I'm going to be really scared. So, for example, the major criticism is, oh, it's going to contaminate the groundwater. But now, a lot of things can contaminate groundwater because groundwater is fairly near the surface. Anytime you're mining or digging for anything, it could be, you could dispose of solar panels and they could get in the groundwater. It could leach in the groundwater. Lots of things can happen. But the thing about where fracking occurs is those formations are usually a mile plus below the groundwater. And so they're very unlikely to contaminate groundwater because they're so far below it. So that's just one quick example of how people are it's a new thing that's being demonized, but it's actually much less threatening to the groundwater than all sorts of things that we take for granted.
How is it that we got to a point where people are not knowledgeable about where energy comes from? Someone said to me, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, actually, excuse me, my goodness, 2 months ago, that many of the people this person talked to on the West Coast didn't realize that coal was still used to produce electricity in the Midwest. What's going on where our society has become so uninformed about its own energy supply? Or was it always that way? I mean, I'll speak personally for myself. I'm a person who lived through the energy crisis in 1976. And in 1978, I bought a book, and I was in high school, called Energy Future, the project of the the book of the Harvey Energy Project. My point is, maybe because it was a pre-internet time, we read a lot of stuff. And as a teenager, I felt like I was pretty aware of what was happening. But by contrast, I don't mean to be condescending to our society, but Alex, something has happened where people don't seem to know the things they should know. What's happening?
Well, it's interesting to think about. There's a parallel here. So when, sometimes when there's a crisis, we get informed about things, or at least we attempt to inform ourselves about things. So you think about right now, everyone has all sorts of ideas, and some of them true, about viruses and contagiousness and stuff that we weren't thinking about at all 3 months ago, right? I mean, and so it's often we learn about things when we're prompted to by some set of events. And what you want out of an educational system is that you proactively learn about the things that are most crucial to your life, that are going to be important throughout your life, regardless of whether there's an apparent crisis. So something like energy is so important because energy I think of as machine calories. It's the food of all the machines that we use. And our whole way of life is based on machines. It's based on getting machines to do physical work for us so that we don't have to do it ourselves, and also so that we can do things like run computers that we could never do at all with any amount of manual labor. And so it's really important to understand that our whole life depends on machine power, and then machine power depends on machine calories. And the lower cost you can make those machine calories, the more people can have access to machine power and benefit from it, and including there are 3 billion people who have basically no machine calories right now. So there's many people in the world who are still living a very primitive life. And these kinds of things should be part of education at any time, because they're timelessly important. Particularly, it's a state of crisis for the people who have very little energy. But and you saw with the energy crisis, so including the different parts of it, but really in 73 is when it emerged.
Right.
And you're starting to, with the Arab oil embargo, and then later you're starting to have people line up for gasoline. Then suddenly people become preoccupied by energy, but in a very reactive way. And back then, if you would ask people, yeah, they'd have some idea of, we're getting our electricity from oil and coal, mostly at the time, some nuclear, and there would be awareness. But by default, but unfortunately, energy is not a part of education. And I would say more broadly, industry is not a part of education.
The only reason I broke in there is because at the time, living at that time, my mother dated a fellow who worked for U.S. Steel. A number of we worked in heavy industry, so the knowledge base was entirely different than today. Just want to add that. That's all.
Yeah, and so it's partially you'll get the knowledge when there's a crisis, or when you just happen to be immersed in it, so it's your job.
Right.
And if you look even at more primitive countries, often they know more about certain industrial things because those are more of an emerging life and death thing. Like if you take, maybe the average person in China may well know more about where electricity comes from than the average person in the US, because for them it's a new issue, it's an existential issue. People are still moving from places without electricity to places with electricity. And part of the challenge of the society is to, again, educate people in these fundamentals. And particularly when we're thinking about our environment and how we relate to our environment, it's very important that the way we survive is by transforming our environment, basically by developing industry to transform our environment into a much more nourishing place than it was 200 years ago, or than it is naturally, and a much safer place and a much more opportunity filled place. And a lot of the theme of my work at Center for Industrial Progress is how industry makes the world a better place for human beings to live. And I think that education doesn't take a huge amount of time. And if people are interested in just learning more, just go to industrialprogress.com, put in your email, and we have free courses on all of this stuff. But it's so important for us to be educated in the fundamentals of how our lives work, because we have such a high standard of living that really has no precedent. And it's really important to understand what makes that possible so it can continue.
And that leads to my next question. I want to say one thing, folks. Buy this book. This man's book. It's a great book. It's a great book. Alex, and out of respect for your time also, but close us out, if you will, because we said 30 minutes, I believe. But where do we go from here? How is the pandemic going to impact our lives?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity right now to change the answer to that question. I think it's in flux right now. I think it could definitely go the direction of permanent decreases in our freedom, permanent decreases in our standard of living. And then on top of that, huge additional interventions to compensate for the destruction. Because if the government's policies are impoverishing people unnecessarily, as I'm claiming, then the question is, what do they do about that? And one of the responses is, well, let's get government even more involved. Let's have more and more different kinds of government programs. And the thing is, you can't solve a problem of lack of productivity by just shuffling around the less and less stuff that's produced. And so the core problem we have right now, I mean, it's a lack of freedom, but economically it's a lack of productive ability. We're being restrained from being able to produce. So I think we really need to think about what are American policies that we can have on this, that really focus on testing and isolating those who are demonstrably dangerous. And I think that includes having extra protections for places like nursing homes, which California and most other states have just failed at completely because they've been focused on locking everyone down instead of protecting the most vulnerable. So I think we have to really focus on what are American policies. And as part of that, leaving us free to live our lives as we judge best and to be productive again. So you could think of it as make America free again, make America productive again. And then part of that is, if we want to compensate in any way for all the loss, it should be, let's think about policies that will make us even more productive. So how do we make energy even lower cost? How do we make American industry even more productive? But I don't think there's any real promise in saying, hey, we're just going to keep undercutting our economy, keep destroying our productive ability, but then we'll keep doing these government programs. It's just trying to pass around a smaller and smaller pie.
Alex, tell them how to get your book.
Oh, well, they can go to Amazon.com, get Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And again, if you're interested in some free resources, go to industrialprogress.com, enter in your email address, and we have a lot of stuff to bring you from zero to industrial genius.
There you go. And folks, I want to say that Insight Terminal Solutions, which is a co-developer with California Capital Investment Group in the Oakland Bulk and Oversized Terminal, is my client. I proudly sought them out. I believe in what they're doing. I've known about this project since 1991 for anybody who wants to chime in. And at Zenny 62 Media, which is now a Delaware C Corp, we broadcast who our clients are. We hide from nothing. Just want everybody to know that.
Good for you.
Thank you. Alex, hey, man.
Right.
Stick around.
Good to see you.
All right, you too. Stick around, Alex, for a second.
Okay.
That was